In the summer of 1848, the town of Montgomery, Alabama was suffocating under heat, silence, and secrets. The cotton fields stretched endlessly beyond the horizon, white and quiet, while the grand plantation houses stood like monuments to wealth built on suffering. Among these estates was the Whitmore plantation, owned not by a single patriarch, as was customary, but by two women who were identical in face, voice, and reputation. Margaret and Eleanor Whitmore were twins. They were 32 years old, unmarried, and among the wealthiest women in the county. Their father had died a decade earlier, leaving them the plantation, the house, the land, and more than 40 enslaved people. In a society that believed women incapable of managing such an estate, the Whitmore twins were an anomaly, respected, envied, and quietly resented. They dressed the same, they spoke the same, they walked side by side as if bound by an invisible thread. And they shared everything, including him. His name was Samuel. Samuel was 26 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, and unusually well-spoken for an enslaved man, something that unsettled visitors who noticed. He worked inside the house, not in the fields. He carried messages, handled horses, repaired furniture, and slept in a small room behind the kitchen. Officially, he belonged to the estate. Unofficially, he belonged to the twins. No one spoke about it openly. In Alabama, silence was currency. But everyone knew. At first, it was subtle. Samuel was called inside more often than necessary. He accompanied the sisters on walks through the garden. He stood behind them during dinner parties, close enough to hear whispers meant for no one else. Servants noticed the way Margaret's hand lingered when she passed him a note. They noticed Eleanor's gaze, long, unblinking, possessive. Samuel noticed too. He had learned early in life that survival depended on observation. He understood power, even when it wore silk dresses and soft smiles. He knew refusal was not an option. Consent did not exist where ownership did. What made the situation dangerous was not the arrangement itself. It was the balance. Margaret was the older twin by 7 minutes and never let Eleanor forget it. She was sharper, more commanding, more accustomed to being obeyed. Eleanor was quieter, more introspective, and far more dependent on her sister's approval. Samuel became the unspoken point of tension between them, a thing neither would acknowledge, yet neither would surrender. At night, Samuel was summoned, sometimes by Margaret, sometimes by Eleanor, sometimes by both, though never at the same time. No records were kept, no words were exchanged. What happened in the house after dark stayed there, buried beneath routine and propriety. Until it didn't. The first sign came in early spring. Margaret began to change. She grew pale, she ate little. She dismissed visitors early and spent long afternoons locked in her room. When the plantation doctor was called, he stayed less than 10 minutes. He did not look Samuel in the eye when he left. Margaret was pregnant. 3 weeks later, Eleanor collapsed in the garden. The truth could no longer hide. Both sisters were expecting children by a man who legally was not a man at all. The plantation erupted in quiet panic. The enslaved community whispered at night, fearful not just of what this meant, but of what would follow. White society would not tolerate scandal, especially not one that exposed what it pretended did not exist. A meeting was held behind closed doors. Margaret wanted Samuel sold, sent west, far away before anyone could connect the truth. Eleanor refused. Selling him would mean admitting what had happened. Worse, it would mean losing control. Samuel was never asked what he wanted. That night, he was locked in his room. 2 weeks later, one of the twins lost her child. No one agrees on which one. The records are contradictory, the letters vague, the gravestone unmarked.
But something else was
After
born
the
that
truth
summer.
surfaced,
Something
the Whitmore
far more
plantation
dangerous than
changed in
scandal.
ways that were subtle to
Resentment.
outsiders, but suffocating
And by
to
autumn,
those who lived
one
within its
sister
boundaries.
would be dead.
The house, once filled with orderly routine and rehearsed politeness, became a place of whispered arguments and closed doors. Margaret and Eleanor no longer walked together in the mornings. They no longer dressed in identical colors. The symmetry that had defined their lives since birth had fractured, and Samuel stood at the center of that fracture, silent, watched, and trapped. The pregnancies could not be hidden for long. Dresses were altered, corsets were loosened, doctors were summoned discreetly and paid generously for their silence. In public, the twins claimed illness and female complications, terms vague enough to discourage further questioning. But Alabama society was not naive. It merely chose when to look away and when to stare. Inside the enslaved quarters, fear spread faster than gossip. The older women knew what this meant. They had seen it before on other plantations, though never with two mistresses at once. When white women crossed lines that society pretended did not exist, someone always paid the price, and it was never the white women. Samuel was confined more strictly. His movements were monitored. He was no longer allowed near visitors or allowed to sleep without supervision. The twins argued constantly about his fate, though neither used his name when speaking of him. He became the problem, the mistake, the thing that must be handled. Margaret believed control meant erasure. She proposed selling Samuel to a plantation in Mississippi far enough that no one could connect him to what was growing inside her. Eleanor opposed this fiercely. She saw the pregnancy not as a scandal, but as proof of something she could not fully articulate, something that bound her to Samuel in a way her sister could not sever. Their arguments grew louder. The silences grew longer. Samuel understood that time was turning against him. He had learned to read faces long before he learned to read words. Margaret's eyes no longer lingered on him with possession, but with calculation. Eleanor's gaze, by contrast, had become desperate, almost pleading, though she never spoke to him directly. In early autumn, the doctor returned. He stayed longer this time. That night, a storm rolled across the plantation, violent and sudden. Thunder shook the house, rain battered the roof, and somewhere between lightning strikes, something irreversible happened. By morning, one of the twins had lost her child. Which twin depends on who tells the story. Margaret's letters claim it was Eleanor, overcome with hysteria and weakness. Eleanor's private journal, discovered decades later, insists it was Margaret, consumed by rage and fear. The official record lists no name at all, only a single line: complications resolved. Resolved was a lie. From that moment on, the sisters were no longer allies. They became rivals bound by blood and shame. Each believed the other responsible for the loss. Each believed the other capable of far worse. Samuel was blamed by both. Restrictions tightened, food was withheld, punishments grew harsher. Yet even then, neither sister allowed him to be sold. He was evidence, he was leverage, he was the living reminder of what they could not undo. And then came the whispers of inheritance. If a child were born, questions would follow: property, bloodlines, names. Alabama's law was clear in theory and cruel in practice. A child born to an enslaved man would not be acknowledged unless silence failed, and silence, the twins realized, was fragile. Margaret began drafting letters. Eleanor began praying. Samuel began planning. He knew escape was nearly impossible. Patrols were everywhere, dogs were trained to track. But he also knew one thing with certainty: if he stayed, he would not survive the winter. Either he would be sold or he would disappear in a way that required no explanation. The night he chose to act, the plantation slept uneasily. Eleanor was awake. She heard footsteps near the kitchen. She knew whose they were. She could have called out. She could have stopped him. Instead, she turned her face to the wall and let the moment pass. Samuel never made it past the outer fields. At dawn, his footprints ended near the river. No body was recovered. Margaret declared it an accident, a foolish attempt at escape. Eleanor said nothing at all. Months later, one of the twins gave birth. The child did not live long. Officially, the Whitmore family line ended quietly. No scandal, no trial, no reckoning. The plantation was sold. The sisters separated. One moved north, the other vanished into marriage records that listed no children. History accepted the version it was given, but the records did not disappear. They waited. And when historians uncovered them more than a century later, they found inconsistencies. 2 pregnancies, 1 man,
The surviving
and a silence
twin
so
lived
carefully
long
maintained
enough to see
that it
the
spoke
world
louder
change,
than any
but
confession,
not enough to
because
escape
everyone
what
knew,
she had helped
and
create.
no one had stopped
In later
it.
years, census records list her as living alone, supported by inherited money. Her occupation left blank. Neighbors described her as distant, prone to long silences, a woman who kept her curtains drawn even during the day. She never spoke of Alabama. She never spoke of her sister. Yet among her belongings, discovered after her death, were fragments of the past she could not bury, letters never sent, dresses altered and then undone, and a small wooden object wrapped carefully in cloth. It was a child's toy, worn smooth by hands that had not lived long enough to grow old. Decades later, when historians began digitizing plantation records and private correspondence from the region, the Whitmore name surfaced again. What first appeared to be routine estate documents revealed contradictions, overlapping medical visits, altered dates, missing signatures, and a sudden unexplained removal of one enslaved man from the inventory without record of sale or death. Cross-referenced with church logs and personal journals, the story that emerged was impossible to dismiss. 2 pregnancies, 1 man, and an entire community that chose silence over truth. The scandal was never that it happened, it was that it was allowed, hidden, and erased with such care. Today, the Whitmore plantation no longer stands. The land has been divided, built over, renamed, but the story remains, unsettling precisely because it is not unique. It is a reminder that history is often written not by what is said, but by what is deliberately left out. The Alabama twin sisters were not monsters in the way legends prefer. They were products of a system that granted them power without accountability and denied humanity to the one person who paid the price.
In the
that
end,
is why
what
this
makes
story
this
still
story
matters,
endure
because
is
it
not the
forces us to
scandal
look
itself,
at the silence
but the
and ask
machinery
who
that
benefited
protected
from
it.
and who
The
never
Whitmore
got the
case
chance to
exposes
speak
how
at all.
entire systems were designed to absorb violence, disguise exploitation, and then quietly reset as if nothing had happened. Doctors altered language to avoid truth. Clerks adjusted dates to preserve reputations. Neighbors learned which questions not to ask. Churches recorded births without fathers and deaths without causes. Even memory itself was managed, shaped by omission, softened by time, and handed down in fragments that sounded almost harmless when stripped of context. Samuel's absence became just another blank space in a ledger, yet that blank space carried the weight of a life erased for convenience. The twins' pregnancies were treated not as evidence of abuse, but as inconveniences to be solved. The children who never lived were reduced to footnotes, their existence acknowledged only indirectly through altered clothing, shortened confinements, and sudden changes in routine. This is how power preserved itself, not through constant brutality, but through normalization, paperwork, and silence. The tragedy is not only what happened on that plantation, but how easily it was allowed to disappear into respectable history. And when we read these records today, long after the fields have vanished and the house has fallen, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The past did not survive by accident. It survived because people chose again and again What ultimately
to
gives
protect
this
the powerful,
story its
to ignore
disturbing
the
power
vulnerable,
is
and
not
to
the
pretend
scandal
that
of
knowing
two pregnancies,
was not the same
nor
as
even the
responsibility.
cruelty inflicted on a man who had no legal right to refuse, but the precision with which the entire system closed ranks to protect itself.
The Whitmore plantation did not collapse because of what happened there. It continued because what happened there fit neatly into a world that already understood how to hide such truths. Every institution surrounding the sisters played its role. The physician chose vague language, not because he did not know the cause, but because clarity would have demanded action. The county clerk altered dates and omitted names, understanding that records were not neutral, they were tools capable of shaping memory itself. Ministers spoke of forgiveness without confession, of sin without accountability, and in doing so, helped transform violence into something abstract, something untraceable. Even the enslaved community was forced into silence, knowing that speech brought punishment, and that remembering too clearly could be as dangerous as rebellion. Samuel's disappearance became the cleanest solution. A man without legal existence did not require explanation when he vanished. No grave, no sale receipt, no death notice, only an empty space where his name once appeared. That absence was intentional. It allowed the twins to continue separately, each rewriting the story in a way that best served her survival. Margaret framed the events as disorder resolved, a regrettable lapse corrected by discipline and distance. Eleanor, by contrast, internalized the truth until it became something corrosive, something that reshaped her entirely. Her later years, as hinted in surviving letters, were marked by anxiety, religious obsession, and a fixation on lineage, on bloodlines that must remain pure, unbroken, unchallenged. The irony, of course, was that the bloodline she feared had already passed through her body, leaving traces that could never be fully erased. As historians would later discover, the most revealing evidence was not a single document, but the pattern formed when many small inconsistencies were viewed together. Medical visits that did not align with recorded illnesses, fabric purchases inconsistent with public appearances, enslaved labor tallies that changed abruptly without explanation. These were not mistakes, they were adjustments made by people who understood exactly what they were doing. The truth had not been forgotten, it had been managed. And this management required cooperation at every level, from the household to the courthouse. That cooperation is what turns individual cruelty into historical tragedy. In the years that followed, the South reinvented itself repeatedly through war, reconstruction, and the slow rebranding of plantations into symbols of heritage rather than exploitation. The Whitmore name faded, not because it was insignificant, but because forgetting was easier than reckoning. Yet stories like this one refuse to stay buried. They resurface in archives, in marginal notes, in the quiet testimony of records that contradict each other just enough to suggest something deliberately concealed. And when they do, they challenge the comforting narrative that such abuses were rare or accidental. They reveal instead a world in which power was intimate, unchecked, and normalized, where entire lives could be used, discarded, and erased, all while society maintained the illusion of order and morality. This is why the story of the Alabama twin sisters matters beyond its shock value. It forces us to confront how exploitation was not only physical, but bureaucratic and psychological. It reminds us that the most enduring violence is often the kind that leaves no visible wound, only silence. Samuel's voice was never recorded, his perspective never preserved, yet his absence echoes through every altered document and every evasive phrase. And in recognizing that echo, we are left with a question that history rarely answers directly. How many similar stories were perfected, hidden, and normalized so thoroughly that they never even became scandals at all?